In the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from the nearest continent, an isolated society survived for centuries without metal tools, large ships, or a conventional writing system. They carved mountains into human faces, transformed barren volcanic ground into productive farmland, and preserved knowledge entirely through memory. But their greatest mystery is not how they raised the Moai. It is how they endured when their forest vanished, their resources declined, and the outside world finally reached their shores. Before we go deeper, like the video and subscribe if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten mysteries of human history. At first light, the island seems less like a homeland than the last piece of land left in the world. Black volcanic ridges rise from the Pacific, their slopes swept by wind, their cliffs dropping into deep blue water with almost nowhere to hide a canoe. There is no neighbouring coast on the horizon, no chain of islands visible in the distance, no reassuring smoke from another settlement. Every direction leads into thousands of kilometres of open ocean. Yet across this isolated landscape stand the faces of ancestors, enormous stone figures with heavy brows, long noses, and bodies partly buried by centuries of soil. They look inland, away from the sea, as though watching over villages that once depended on them. Their presence creates an immediate contradiction. How does a society living in one of the most remote places on Earth, without metal tools and without a conventional written record, organize the labour, food, knowledge, and belief required to transform entire mountains into monuments? The island is known today by several names. To much of the world, it is Easter Island, a name given after a Dutch expedition reached it on Easter Sunday in 1722. Its indigenous name, Rapa Nui, is now more widely used, though the island may also have carried older names whose meanings remain debated. It lies in the southeastern Pacific, far east of the central Polynesian archipelagos, and more than 3,000 kilometres from the coast of South America. This distance matters because isolation is not merely part of the scenery. It shapes almost every decision the islanders make. A failed harvest cannot easily be repaired by importing grain. A broken canoe may mean the loss of fishing grounds. A shortage of timber cannot be solved by sailing to the next forest. Once the first settlers arrive, survival depends on learning the limits of a small volcanic world and then pushing those limits with extraordinary care. The mystery begins long before the statues. It begins with navigation. Polynesian voyagers cross immense stretches of ocean in double-hulled or outrigger canoes, carrying plants, animals, tools, water, and the memory of stars. They read wave patterns, cloud formations, bird movements, winds, and the subtle glow that islands can cast beneath the horizon. Rapa Nui is a tiny target in an enormous sea. Reaching it is not an accident in the simple sense, though scholars still debate the exact route. Timing and circumstances of settlement. Radiocarbon evidence generally places permanent colonization around the late 12th or early 13th century, later than older theories once suggested. What survives in the record suggests a founding population small enough to be vulnerable, yet skilled enough to establish itself quickly. Those first people do not step onto a barren island. They encounter a landscape very different from the grass-covered terrain seen today. Pollen, charcoal, plant remains, and sediments indicate that Rapa Nui once supported extensive palm woodland, along with shrubs, grasses, and other native vegetation. The largest palms may have resembled the Chilean wine palm, although the exact appearance of the vanished forest must be reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. Seabirds nest in greater numbers than they do now. Coastal waters provide fish, shellfish, and marine mammals, while volcanic soils offer possibilities for cultivation, There are also problems from the beginning. Fresh water is limited. Rainfall varies across the island. Strong winds dry the ground. The surrounding ocean is productive in some places, but lacks the broad lagoons and coral reefs that support dense fishing elsewhere in Polynesia. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the story of Rapa Nui is not simply a warning about destruction, nor is it only a tale of giant statues. It is a long experiment in adaptation, one carried out by generations who cannot rely on metal, writing, draft animals, wheels, or regular contact with distant populations. Their technology is built from basalt, obsidian, bone, shell, wood, fibre, an accumulated experience. Knowledge passes through memory, teaching, ritual, genealogy, demonstration, and repetition. A planting method that works in one valley may fail on an exposed slope. A canoe design that wastes timber may become impossible to replace. Every successful technique becomes part of survival, and every mistake can echo for decades. The phrase "without writing" requires care. Rapa Nui later produces the enigmatic Rongorongo tablets, marked with rows of tiny carved signs. Whether these signs represent full writing, a mnemonic system, ritual notation, or something else remains unresolved. No agreed decipherment exists, and the surviving tablets appear to date from the period of European contact or afterward, when the older society is already under severe pressure for most of the island's independent history. There is no known written archive comparable to those of Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, or the Maya. This means the island's past survives unevenly. Archaeologists read abandoned gardens, house foundations, tools, bones, quarries, ceremonial platforms, and layers of charcoal. Oral traditions preserve names and memories, but they also pass through generations marked by epidemic disease, enslavement, conversion, and colonial rule. The evidence remains incomplete, and certainty is often less honest than careful reconstruction. That incompleteness helped create one of the most persistent modern myths about the island, the idea that its people destroyed their environment, descended into chaos, and vanished before Europeans arrived. It is a powerful story because it turns the island into a miniature model of planetary collapse. But the archaeological record is more complicated. Forest loss is real. Ecological transformation is real. Conflict and political change also occur. Yet the islanders do not simply disappear after cutting down the last tree. They develop sophisticated methods to protect soil, conserve moisture, and grow food in damaged ground. They reorganize ritual life. They continue raising families across a landscape that outsiders often mistake for exhausted emptiness. When Europeans arrive in 1722, they meet a living society, not the silent aftermath of extinction. The real question, then, is not how foolish people ruined a paradise. It is how a small community survives for centuries after reaching a place with no easy escape, limited resources, and environmental conditions that change partly because of its own success. The statues are part of that answer, but only part. Beneath them lies a deeper system of cooperation, rivalry, memory, engineering, agriculture, and belief. To understand it, the story must return to the moment when unfamiliar canoes first approach the cliffs, when the island is still forested, the quarries untouched, and the future exists only as a thin line of dark land rising from the sea. Long before anyone carves a face into the island's volcanic stone, a canoe appears beyond the breakers. It is low in the water from the weight of people, food, tools, and living cargo. The voyage behind it may have lasted weeks, Salt coats the voyagers' skin. Their water containers are lighter than when they began, and the plants wrapped carefully against wind and spray have survived only because someone has checked them day after day. The people aboard do not know the island as Rapa Nui. They know it first as a dark interruption in the horizon, then as cliffs, slopes, birds, and the smell of vegetation carried out over the sea. After an ocean crossing measured not in kilometres but in stars, swells, and nights without land, even a difficult coast is a promise. The settlers are part of the wider Polynesian expansion, one of the most remarkable episodes of human movement in pre-modern history. Their ancestors have already crossed much of the Pacific, moving eastward through island groups separated by distances that would make land invisible for days at a time. They are not wandering without direction. Polynesian navigation depends on a disciplined understanding of the ocean. Navigators memorize where stars rise and set, how swells bend around islands, which birds feed near land, and what certain cloud formations may reveal. They carry mental maps rather than written charts. Routes are preserved through teaching and repeated performance, and the loss of an experienced navigator can mean the loss of knowledge gathered over generations. The exact homeland of Rapa Nui's founding population remains debated, though linguistic, archaeological, and genetic evidence places them firmly within eastern Polynesia. Islands such as Mangareva, the Marquesas, and the broader region around the southeastern edge of Polynesian settlement have all entered scholarly discussion. No single reconstruction fully accounts for every clue. The voyage may have been planned as colonization, or it may have followed exploration, displacement, political tension, or a navigational error that ended in discovery. What matters is that those aboard bring the cultural and biological foundation of a new society. They do not arrive empty-handed. A colonizing canoe in Polynesia is not simply transportation. It is a floating archive of survival. The passengers carry stone adzes for cutting wood, blades made from sharp volcanic material, fishing hooks, cordage, woven mats, and the knowledge of how to replace these items from local resources. They also carry plants whose survival is essential. Sweet potato becomes especially important on Rapa Nui, joined by crops such as taro, yam, banana, and sugarcane where conditions permit. Chickens provide meat, feathers, bones, and a living reserve of protein. Polynesian rats probably arrive as well, whether deliberately carried as food or unintentionally hidden among the cargo. Their future impact on the island's vegetation will be far greater than anyone stepping ashore can imagine. The landing itself is difficult to reconstruct. Rapa Nui has few protected bays, and much of its shoreline consists of cliffs or rough volcanic rock battered by waves. Anakina, with its sandy beach and access to nearby fresh water, stands out as one of the most plausible early landing places. Oral traditions later connect the beach with Hotu Matua, remembered as the founding ancestor or king who leads the first settlers to the island. Archaeology cannot confirm every detail of this tradition, and the stories preserved in later centuries have passed through enormous disruption. Yet Anakina's importance is not only legendary. Excavations there reveal early settlement activity, making it one of the places where memory and material evidence come closest to touching. The newcomers search first for what keeps people alive through the next days rather than the next century. They need drinking water, shelter from the wind, a safe place to pull up canoes, and ground where transported crops can be planted. Fresh water on the island is scarce in ways that are not immediately obvious. There are no permanent rivers flowing through deep valleys. Rain gathers in volcanic craters, seeps into the ground, and emerges along parts of the coast. People learn to use crater lakes, shallow wells, springs, and brackish coastal sources. Later generations will understand these water systems intimately, but the first settlers must discover them by walking, tasting, observing vegetation, and following the movements of birds. They explore a triangular island shaped by three major volcanic centers. In the southwest rises Rano Kau, its broad crater holding a lake among floating mats of vegetation. To the east stands Poike, older and more heavily weathered. In the north rises Terevaka, the highest point, though still low enough that the entire landscape remains exposed to ocean winds. Between them lie rolling slopes, smaller cones, lava fields, and patches of forest. The island is only about 24 kilometers long, small enough to cross on foot, yet varied enough that different zones offer different possibilities. Rain falls more reliably in some areas. Soils differ in depth and fertility. Certain coasts provide better access to fish, while others offer nesting birds, shellfish, or stones suitable for tools. The forest would have altered the island's appearance dramatically. Palms and other woody plants provide fuel, fibre, building material, and habitat for birds. Fallen leaves help protect the soil. Roots slow erosion. Trees offer shade to young crops and material for canoes, houses, handles, digging sticks, rollers, sledges, and ceremonial objects. Yet the forest is not limitless, even when it appears extensive. Rapa Nui's small size means every clearing represents a measurable portion of the total supply. Palm trees grow slowly, and introduced rats feed on seeds, reducing regeneration. This does not cause immediate disaster. Ecological change unfolds over generations, often too gradually for any one person to see the full direction of it. The first settlement may consist of only a few extended families, but even a small group must make social decisions. Land needs to be divided or shared. Work must be coordinated. The best planting areas cannot support unlimited claims. Fishing, construction, childcare, cooking, and tool-making depend on cooperation. Polynesian settlers bring systems of rank, kinship, sacred authority, and inherited obligation from their ancestral societies. These structures are not copied perfectly onto the new island. Isolation changes them. With no neighbouring population to trade with regularly, almost every necessary material must come from within the island or from the sea around it. A leader who wastes resources risks more than embarrassment. A family that loses access to productive land may have nowhere else to go. In the early years, however, the island still offers abundance in forms that later become rare. Seabirds nest in large colonies, unaccustomed to human hunters. Their eggs and flesh are easily collected. Fish, dolphins, shellfish, and perhaps sea turtles supplement the crops. Birds provide feathers for adornment and bones for tools. Archaeological remains suggest that early diets include more marine resources than those of later centuries. This change may reflect declining access to large canoes, pressure on nearby animal populations, or shifting economic priorities. Scholars still debate the relative importance of each factor, but the pattern hints at a society slowly becoming more dependent on the land. The settlers bury their dead, establish homes, and name the features around them. A crater becomes more than a crater once it is tied to an ancestor or event. A beach becomes the place where the first canoe arrived. A ridge becomes a boundary between families. Through naming, the island is transformed from unknown geography into inherited territory. Children are born who have never seen any other land. For them, the ocean is not a road from an old homeland but the edge of the entire human world. The founding generation may still remember the islands behind them, They may remember taller trees, broader lagoons, unfamiliar birds, and relatives left beyond the horizon. Those memories fade as the years pass. Canoes may attempt return voyages or further exploration, but reliable contact with the wider Polynesian world appears to diminish. Whether Rapa Nui becomes isolated immediately or gradually remains uncertain. The evidence suggests some early connections may have persisted, yet eventually the island stands largely alone. The knowledge brought across the sea must now be reshaped for a place unlike any the settlers have known. Their survival is not guaranteed. One severe drought, one failed crop cycle, or one storm-destroying canoes could threaten the entire community. Yet the settlement endures. Gardens spread. Children become parents. Paths form between the coast and the interior. The temporary camp at the edge of the sea becomes a permanent society, and as the first graves anchor families to the land, departure becomes less imaginable. The island is no longer merely where the voyagers arrived. It is where their ancestors rest, where their descendants will live, and where every future solution must be built from what the island itself can provide. The island begins to change almost as soon as the first gardens survive their first seasons. What was once a landing place becomes a network of homes, paths, planting grounds, fishing stations, workshops, and sacred spaces. None of this is created with iron blades, wheeled carts, or draft animals. The settlers work with what the island offers. Basalt becomes adzes. Obsidian breaks into edges sharp enough to cut wood. Fibre, meat, and skin. Bone becomes needles, hooks, points, and ornaments. Shell becomes scraper, lure, container, and decoration. Plant fibres become cordage strong enough to bind rafters, lash canoe parts, and carry loads. The society survives because almost nothing can afford to serve only one purpose. A house begins as a calculation. It must resist wind, preserve warmth, use little timber, and occupy ground that cannot be wasted. Some dwellings later take the form now called hair penga, long, low houses with fitted stone foundation blocks arranged like the outline of an overturned canoe. Curved poles support a thatched roof, while the narrow entrance forces a person to crawl inside. The shape gives the wind less to seize. The stone foundations endure, but the upper structure decays. So archaeology often preserves the footprint while erasing the living space above it. What survives in the record suggests households sleeping close together in dark interiors, with most work taking place outside. Around the houses, ordinary life leaves quieter traces than monuments do. Hearths stain the earth with charcoal. Stone chicken houses protect valuable birds from theft and weather. Small ovens are dug into the ground, lined with heated stones, and covered so food can steam beneath earth and leaves. Storage pits protect crops from sun and scarcity. None of these systems is spectacular alone, yet together they make permanent settlement possible. Water shapes those decisions more than almost any other resource. Rain gathers in crater lakes, but many settlements lie far from them. Along the coast, fresh groundwater seeps through porous volcanic rock and mixes with seawater. At low tide, people collect it from shallow basins or coastal springs that appear brackish but remain usable. Stone-lined wells and catchments help control access. Some researchers argue that these sources explain why many settlements and ceremonial platforms cluster near the shoreline. Scholars still debate how heavily each community depends on them, yet the pattern reveals something easily missed on Rapa Nui. The edge of the sea is also part of the freshwater landscape. Food production demands equal flexibility. Imported crops carry the memory of warmer and wetter islands. But Rapa Nui does not always treat them kindly. Taro prefers reliable moisture. Bananas suffer in exposed areas. Sweet potato proves more forgiving, producing food where other crops struggle. The settlers plant behind natural shelter and learn to read differences in slope, drainage, and soil depth. They use digging sticks rather than ploughs. Human labour turns the earth, moves stones, weeds plots, and carries harvests. With no large domesticated animals, there is no traction and little manure. Fertility must be protected through mulching, household waste, careful placement, and close attention to the ground. The sea remains essential, but it is not limitless. Fishing requires hooks, line, bait, skill, and boats capable of passing dangerous surf. Canoes demand suitable timber, fibre lashings, and constant repair. Early settlers may possess vessels larger than those seen by later Europeans, though the timing of their decline remains uncertain. From shore, islanders catch fish, gather shellfish, hunt seabirds, and collect eggs. Marine foods vary by season and place. Tools reveal how closely technology follows geology. Basalt from certain sources is tough enough for heavy cutting. Obsidian, formed when lava cools rapidly, can be fractured into extremely sharp flakes. Rapa Nui craftspeople shape it into tools often called mata. These objects later acquire a dark reputation because some appear spear-like, but many may have served ordinary functions such as scraping, cutting, cultivation, or processing food. No single explanation fully accounts for their variety. A blade that prepares a meal can also become a weapon, and archaeology does not preserve the intention of the hand that last held it. Without conventional writing, technical knowledge lives in people. A child learns by watching how a knot is tied, how a stone is struck, how a planting mound is repaired after rain, and how clouds over one slope may signal different weather from clouds over another. Memory is practical infrastructure. Genealogies define inheritance. Oral histories explain who belongs to which land. Rituals organize labor and reinforce obligations. Experts emerge as canoe builders, gardeners, stoneworkers, healers, navigators, and keepers of ancestral knowledge. Their authority depends partly on results. A poorly made adze breaks, a badly timed planting fails, a forgotten boundary invites conflict. The island's small size makes cooperation unavoidable, but it does not erase competition. Extended families need one another for large tasks, marriage, exchange, and defense, while guarding access to fertile ground, fishing places, and stone sources. Labor can be pooled through kinship and ceremony. Food can be redistributed during feasts. Prestige grows around those who organize successful work and maintain relationships with ancestors. Long before the great statues dominate the landscape, the foundations of monument building already exist. People know how to mobilize groups, feed workers, transmit specialized skill, and turn difficult labor into social meaning. A lesser-known feature of this adaptation is how little distinction exists between survival and symbolism. A stone is not merely a stone if it comes from a place associated with ancestry or power. A house is not simply shelter if its position expresses rank. A meal is not only calories if sharing it creates obligation. The practical and sacred worlds overlap. This is why later achievements cannot be explained only by engineering. The same hands that build wind-resistant homes and cultivate fragile crops will eventually carve mountainsides into human forms, because survival is understood through relationships among the living, the land, and the dead. By the time several generations have passed, the founding camp has become a homeland dense with memory. Paths cross the slopes, Gardens mark family claims. Smoke rises from ovens. Children know which stones cut best, which coves are dangerous, and where fresh water can be gathered in dry weather. The island still has forests and materials that later become scarce, but daily life already depends on repair and improvisation. Nothing is abundant enough to waste forever. Even before anyone recognizes how sharply the island's limits will close around them, the forest does not vanish in a single catastrophic season. There is no morning when the islanders wake to discover that every palm has fallen and every slope has become bare. The change is slower, spread across lifetimes, hidden inside thousands of reasonable decisions. A family clears ground for sweet potatoes. A house requires poles and thatch. A canoe needs planks, ribs, lashings, and replacements after years of salt and surf. Fires consume fuel. Ceremonies demand timber. New settlements open new gardens. Each act makes sense on its own, and for a long time the forest still appears large enough to absorb them. Yet Rapa Nui is not a continent. Its trees cannot retreat into distant valleys or recover beyond the reach of settlement. The island contains only so much land, and the same isolation that protects its society from invasion also traps every ecological consequence within a narrow boundary. Pollen preserved in crater sediments shows a long decline in palm vegetation as grasses and disturbance-tolerant plants become more common. Charcoal layers reveal repeated burning. Palm nuts found in caves and soils carry marks suggesting they were gnawed by Polynesian rats, animals with no native predators on the island. The combined pressure of cutting, fire, cultivation, and seed consumption gradually reduces the forest's ability to replace itself. The rats are easy to overlook because they are small, but their influence may be enormous. A pair hidden aboard a canoe can become thousands within a few years. They eat stored food, birds' eggs, insects, and seeds, on an island dominated by slow-growing palms. The destruction of nuts can interrupt regeneration even where mature trees remain standing. Similar patterns appear on other Pacific islands after human settlement. This does not absolve people of responsibility, nor does it prove that rats alone destroyed the woodland. Scholars still debate the relative weight of human clearing, fire, climate variation, and introduced animals. What survives in the record suggests that deforestation is a combined process rather than a single mistake with a single cause. The people living through it may not perceive the full pattern. An elder remembers taller trees near a childhood settlement. A builder walks farther to find a straight trunk. A canoe maker begins using smaller pieces lashed together, rather than one large section of wood. These are warnings, but they arrive gradually. Human beings are skilled at noticing sudden danger, and less reliable at recognizing changes that unfold across generations. The forest of one century becomes the shrubland of the next, and children accept as normal a landscape their grandparents would have considered depleted. As trees disappear, the effects spread beyond the loss of timber. Roots once held soil against rain and wind. Leaves softened the impact of storms and returned nutrients to the ground. Shade slowed evaporation. Forest habitat supported nesting birds and insects. When slopes are cleared, exposed soil can dry, erode, or lose fertility. Strong ocean winds move freely across open ground, damaging crops and carrying away fine particles. Rainwater runs faster over compacted surfaces. The island's volcanic soils remain productive in places, but cultivation becomes more demanding. Farmers must protect the ground rather than merely clear it. The disappearance of large trees also changes the sea. Canoes capable of deep-water fishing become harder to build and replace. Early archaeological deposits contain bones from dolphins and larger pelagic fish. evidence that people once travelled farther offshore or possessed more substantial vessels. In later periods, diets appear to rely more heavily on coastal resources and terrestrial foods. The evidence remains incomplete, and changes in bone preservation or settlement location may affect the pattern, but declining access to suitable timber offers a persuasive explanation. The ocean still surrounds the island, yet part of it becomes less reachable. Seabird populations also retreat. When the first settlers arrive, nesting colonies may provide an extraordinary supply of meat, eggs, feathers, and bone. Birds that evolved without land predators often nest openly and show little fear of humans. Hunting pressure, habitat loss, and rat predation reduce those colonies, forcing survivors toward inaccessible cliffs and offshore islets. Species disappear from the archaeological record. The island does not become lifeless, but a source of easy protein narrows, placing more pressure on gardens and chickens. This transformation was once presented as proof that the islanders blindly destroyed the basis of their civilization in order to transport statues. The image is memorable, every last tree sacrificed to move ever larger monuments until famine and warfare follow. But the neatness of that story is its weakness. No direct evidence shows that statue transport consumed the entire forest, and experimental archaeology demonstrates that moai can be moved in several ways with surprisingly limited wood. Some researchers have shown that upright statues can be rocked forward using ropes, creating the impression that they walk. Oral traditions themselves describe statues moving toward their platforms. This does not prove one universal method, but it undermines the assumption that endless wooden rollers were required. Climate may also complicate the picture. Rapa Nui experiences periods of variable rainfall, and broader Pacific climate patterns can produce droughts or shifts in storm frequency. A dry interval would slow forest recovery and increase fire risk. Yet climate alone cannot explain the pollen record, the spread of agriculture, or the arrival of rats. No single explanation fully accounts for the ecological change. The strongest interpretation is that people reshape the island while adapting to natural limits, and those limits tighten as the population grows and older resources decline. What is remarkable is not merely that the forest disappears, but that society continues after it does. The islanders do not wait passively for starvation. They alter the landscape again, this time in ways designed to preserve moisture and fertility. Stones are spread across fields, walls rise around small gardens, depressions shelter plants from wind, crops are placed where heat and condensation can be controlled. The same volcanic fragments that make cultivation difficult become tools for protecting it. To an outsider, the increasingly stony ground may look ruined. To a skilled Rapa Nui farmer, it becomes engineered soil. The change also affects political life. Timber, fertile land, fresh water, and productive coastlines acquire greater value as they become unevenly distributed. Groups that control the best resources gain leverage. Cooperation remains necessary, but scarcity can sharpen rivalry. Monument building may serve as a way to express authority, bind communities together, and claim ancestral rights over territory. The statues rising along the coast do not stand apart from ecological pressure. They emerge within a society negotiating who belongs to the land and who can command the labour needed to make that belonging visible. By the time the tallest palms become rare, Rapa Nui is no longer the island the first voyagers found. The canopy has opened. Winds move differently across the slopes. Birds once heard everywhere survive mainly in distant places. Canoes become more precious. Soil demands more work. Yet villages remain occupied. Crops continue to grow, and ceremonial centres expand. The forest disappearance does not mark the end of the society. It marks the beginning of a harsher phase. one in which survival depends less on inherited abundance and more on human ingenuity. Across the open landscape, the quarries are already growing louder. Stone strikes stone, chips scatter beneath unfinished faces. As wood becomes scarce and the environment more difficult, the islanders begin creating monuments that seem to deny limitation altogether. They turn to the one material Rapa Nui still possesses in overwhelming quantity, and from the walls of a volcano they begin releasing ancestors. The sound at Rano Raraku is not the ring of iron on stone. It is a harder, duller rhythm, basalt striking compressed volcanic ash, again and again, across the inner and outer slopes of the crater. Here, hundreds of figures emerge from the mountain in different stages of completion. Some are only outlines cut into the rock, others lie almost free, attached along the back by a narrow keel. Still others stand upright in pits below the quarry, their bodies buried deep in accumulated soil. The crater is not simply a source of material. It is a landscape of production, ritual, memory, and unfinished intention, crowded with faces that appear to be waiting for movement. Most moai are carved from volcanic tuff, a relatively soft rock formed from compacted ash. This makes large-scale carving possible with stone tools, but soft is a misleading word when the task involves creating figures weighing many tons. Craftspeople use toki, handheld picks and adzes made from harder basalt. Thousands of these tools have been found in and around the quarry. Their edges dull or fracture under repeated blows and must be sharpened, replaced, or discarded. The work demands not only strength, but coordination. Different teams may rough out the body, refine the face, smooth surfaces, and prepare the statue for separation from the bedrock. Knowledge passes from experienced carvers to apprentices through observation and practice, with no surviving technical manual to explain the sequence. The majority of the statues share a recognizable form: elongated heads, prominent brows, narrow lips, long ears, and arms held close against the body, with hands resting near the abdomen. Their proportions are not attempts at ordinary realism. The head dominates because identity, authority, and sacred power are expressed through the face. Many statues once possessed inlaid eyes made from white coral with pupils of dark stone or red scoria. These eyes were likely added after a moai reached its ceremonial platform. Without them, the statues appear solemn and inward. With them, they would have looked startlingly awake. Carving begins while the figure lies on its back within the slope. Workers cut trenches along the sides, shaping the front and profile while the stone remains supported by the mountain. Fine details are added before the back is fully released. Eventually, the carvers remove material beneath the body until only a ridge connects it to the quarry. That final support is cut, allowing the statue to be lowered carefully down the slope. It may then be placed upright in a prepared pit so the back can be completed. The process is dangerous. A hidden fracture in the tuff can ruin months of labour. A miscalculated descent can break the neck or body. Abandoned statues show that failure is part of the quarry's history. Some figures never leave Rano Raraku because defect appear during carving. Others may have been abandoned when political or ritual priorities changed. The largest, known as El Gigante, remains attached to the rock and would have stood more than 20 meters tall if completed. Its estimated weight exceeds anything the islanders are known to have transported. It may represent extreme ambition, a demonstration of skill, or a project halted when its impracticality became clear. Scholars still debate whether it was ever truly intended for removal. Whatever the answer, its immense outline reveals that the carvers were willing to test the boundaries of what their methods could achieve. Completed moai had to travel from the quarry to platforms scattered across the island, sometimes over distances of many kilometers. This is where speculation has flourished. Earlier theories imagined statues laid flat on wooden sledges and dragged over rollers, consuming enormous quantities of timber. Such methods are mechanically possible, but they are not the only possibilities. Archaeological roads leading away from Rana Raraku show broad, slightly concave surfaces, and several statues lie broken along these routes. Their shapes differ subtly from statues already installed on platforms. Road moai often have wider bases and a forward centre of gravity, features that may assist upright movement. Modern experiments have demonstrated that a replica can be moved while standing. Teams control ropes attached on both sides and from behind, rocking the statue from one edge of its base to the other and turning it forward in small steps. The movement resembles a heavy cabinet being walked across a floor, though on a far larger and more dangerous scale. With skilled coordination, relatively small groups can move a multi-ton figure without rollers. This does not prove every moai travelled in precisely this way. Some may have been transported horizontally, and different periods or communities may have used different techniques. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the walking method carries an intriguing connection to oral tradition, which remembers statues moving through sacred power rather than being dragged helplessly across the ground. That memory may preserve more than a poetic image. From a distance, an upright moai rocked by ropes would seem to sway and step. The workers themselves might understand the movement as a partnership between human skill and ancestral force. Engineering and belief do not compete here. Ritual can discipline labour, coordinate timing, and give exhausting work a purpose larger than construction. Songs or chants may have helped teams pull in rhythm, though no direct record preserves the sound of those journeys. The roads are themselves part of the achievement. Builders clear routes, manage slopes, and avoid terrain where a falling statue would be impossible to recover. The figures moving along them can weigh 10, 20, or far more tons. A slight error compounds quickly. Ropes must withstand sudden loads. Fibers must be twisted and maintained. Workers must communicate across the entire team. Food and water must be supplied during a journey that may last days or weeks. The transport of a moai is therefore not only a technical operation but a test of community organisation. At the destination, the statue is raised onto an ahu, a ceremonial stone platform that may also contain burials. Platform construction requires its own specialists. Large blocks are fitted into retaining walls, with rubble filling the interior. Some masonry is remarkably precise, though it varies greatly across sites. Ramps of stone and earth may help lift the moai into position. Levers, ropes, and incremental packing allow workers to raise the figure gradually, rather than in one dramatic pull. Once upright, the statue faces inland toward the territory and descendants of the ancestor it represents. Some moai receive pukao, large cylindrical top knots carved from red scoria at the separate quarry of Punapau. These blocks can weigh several tons. Their red colour may evoke hair, rank, or sacred vitality. Transporting and placing them adds another layer of difficulty. Experiments suggest they could be rolled up ramps and tipped into position, but the exact methods remain debated. The achievement lies not in one secret technique, but in combining many ordinary techniques with extraordinary patience. Metal is unnecessary because the islanders understand their stone. Writing is unnecessary because the process lives in trained bodies, remembered sequences, and social institutions capable of preserving specialized knowledge. The moai are not primitive attempts at monumentality. They are products of a mature technical tradition adapted to local geology and human labor. Across the island, the statues multiply. Their backs turn to the ocean while their faces watch gardens, houses, and paths. Each new monument declares that a community possesses ancestors powerful enough to stand in stone, yet their purpose is not exhausted by prestige. To understand why so much effort is invested in these silent figures, One must look beyond the quarry and toward the living people gathered beneath their gaze. The Moai do not face the sea as sentinels against invasion. Most turn their backs to the ocean and look inland, toward the people, fields, and homes connected to the communities that raised them. This orientation is one of the clearest clues to their meaning. They are not simply statues placed for decoration, nor are they portraits in the modern sense. They embody ancestors whose presence continues after death, ancestors believed to influence fertility, protection, status, and the well-being of descendants. Their stone bodies make lineage visible, and their gaze fixes that lineage onto the land. In Polynesian societies, ancestry is not a private matter. It determines rights, rank, obligation, and belonging. A family's claim to gardens, fishing places, or ceremonial authority may depend on descent from remembered founders. On Rapa Nui, where every productive slope and coastal spring matters, genealogy becomes a form of geography. The dead help explain why the living occupy a particular place. An ahu with Moai does more than honour those who came before. It announces that a community is rooted there, and that its leaders can organise labour on their behalf. The concept often used to describe this sacred effectiveness is mana, a force associated with authority, achievement, ancestry, and spiritual potency across Polynesia. Mana is not exactly magic in the simple popular sense. It is quality that can be inherited, demonstrated, threatened, or lost. A Moai, especially once placed on an ahu and given eyes, can concentrate and express the mana of an ancestor. The figure becomes active within the social world because the community treats ancestral power as present and consequential. This helps explain the eyes. Many Moai appear blank today, but fragments found at ceremonial sites show that some once carried white coral eye inlays, often with dark pupils. These were probably installed after the statue reached its platform. The act may have marked the moment when the ancestor became fully present. A carved body lying unfinished in the quarry is potential. A figure raised, completed, and given sight becomes a participant in the community. Sunlight on coral eyes could make the face seem alert, especially during ceremonies held in front of the platform. The ahu themselves contain the dead. Many serve as burial places, receiving human remains over long periods. Cremated bone, burial chambers, and later additions reveal that these platforms are not static monuments, completed once and left unchanged. They grow with communities. Walls are rebuilt, ramps are extended, statues are added or replaced, burials continue. The site becomes an accumulated record of generations, written in stone, bone, and spatial arrangement rather than script. Ceremonies probably draw people from surrounding households into the open plaza before the platform. Food is prepared and shared. Leaders display generosity. Specialists perform rituals. Genealogies and histories may be recited. The exact sequence is lost, and scholars still debate how much later oral tradition can be projected backward into the monument building period. Yet the architecture itself is designed for gathering. The broad space allows communities to assemble beneath the faces of their ancestors, turning belief into a public event. The statues also reveal competition. As lineages grow and territories become more clearly defined, communities may seek larger or more numerous Moai to demonstrate prestige. Monumental construction makes authority visible to neighbours, a leader capable of feeding carvers, rope makers, transport crews, and platform builders proves control over resources and loyalty. This does not mean every statue is the product of hostility. Competition can coexist with cooperation, marriage, exchange, and shared ritual traditions. Rival groups often imitate one another precisely because they agree on what counts as impressive. Size is not the only measure of significance. Some modest statues may represent ancestors of great local importance. Placement can matter more than scale. A moai watching a vital garden zone or freshwater source links sacred protection to practical survival. Certain ahu align with coastal features, paths, or astronomical events, though claims of precise universal alignments should be treated cautiously. No single explanation fully accounts for every platform. Rapa Nui's ceremonial landscape develops over centuries, and meanings change as older monuments are rebuilt. A lesser-known detail is that the statues were once more visually complex than their weathered surfaces suggest. Some may have been painted with red and white pigments. Carved designs on backs and bodies include belts, loincloth forms, and symbolic motifs. A few carry later petroglyphs, connecting them to changing ritual traditions. The pale grey figures seen after centuries of erosion are stripped remains of objects that may once have combined colour, coral, red scoria, polished stone, and ceremony. The moai are not images of extraterrestrials, lost giants, or a vanished race unrelated to the islanders. Despite the popularity of such claims, their forms emerge from Polynesian carving traditions, while quarry debris, tools, transport roads, and unfinished statues preserve the stages of local production. Fringe theories often begin by treating the achievement as too extraordinary for indigenous people. The evidence points in the opposite direction. The statues are remarkable because they arise from local knowledge, community labour, and centuries of experimentation. Their creation may also help hold society together during environmental change. Large projects give rival households a shared objective. Feasts redistribute food. Ritual confirms social roles. Ancestors provide a language for explaining hardship and success. When crops grow and children survive, ancestral protection appears effective. When drought, scarcity, or conflict intensifies, communities may respond by investing more heavily in ritual, enlarging platforms or commissioning new figures in the hope of restoring balance. Archaeology cannot recover individual motives, but monument building often expands not only during abundance but during uncertainty. This creates a hidden tension. The moai symbolize continuity, yet the society around them is changing. Forests decline, offshore resources become harder to reach, agriculture demands greater labour, clans compete for authority while depending on one another for specialised work. The statues look permanent, but their production rests on food surpluses, social trust, and leaders capable of coordinating people without pushing them beyond endurance. If those foundations weaken, the sacred landscape can no longer grow in the same way. For several centuries, however, the system works. Along much of the coast, ancestors stand on raised platforms, watching the living world. Smoke rises from ovens behind them, gardens spread across the slopes, children grow beneath stone faces carved before they were born. To the communities of Rapa Nui, the statues are not mysterious. They are family, authority, memory, and protection made visible. The mystery comes later, when their eyes disappear, their bodies fall, and outsiders encounter only silence where ceremonies once gave the stone a voice. The open slopes of Rapa Nui can look almost hostile to agriculture. Wind crosses the island without resistance. Rainfall is uneven, and water drains quickly through porous volcanic ground. In exposed places, the soil loses moisture under sun and salt-laden air. There are no rivers carrying fertile silt across broad floodplains, no large animals producing manure, and no neighbouring island from which grain can be imported after a poor season. Yet beneath this apparently exhausted landscape lies one of the islanders' greatest achievements. The survival of Rapa Nui does not depend only on statues or ritual authority. It depends on farmers who learn to turn broken volcanic stone into a tool for keeping plants alive. To an unfamiliar eye, Fields covered with loose rocks may resemble land abandoned after clearing. Archaeologists once underestimated them for the same reason. Closer study reveals deliberate patterns. Across large areas, islanders spread fragments of basalt and other volcanic material over the ground, creating what are often called lithic mulch gardens or rock gardens. The stones reduce evaporation by shading the soil and slowing the movement of drying winds at ground level. They protect the surface from erosion during heavy rain. Temperature differences between stone and air encourage condensation, adding small amounts of moisture where every contribution matters. As the rock weathers, it can also release minerals into the soil. The system is not decorative or occasional. Rock gardening extends across substantial parts of the island. Though the density and design vary from one area to another, larger stones may be set upright as windbreaks. Smaller fragments are scattered around crops. In some places, gardeners break the upper layer of bedrock to create a rough surface that traps soil and moisture. This practice requires enormous labour. Stones must be carried, arranged, and maintained. A field is not prepared once and forgotten. Its protective structure must survive wind, rain, trampling, and repeated planting. Sweet potato becomes the island's central crop partly because it tolerates conditions that defeat more demanding plants. It grows underground, where the edible roots are protected from wind and brief dry spells. It can produce useful harvests in relatively poor soil, and its vines help cover the ground. Taro, bananas, yams, sugarcane, and gourd survive in more sheltered or moist locations, but their success is less reliable. Crop diversity remains important because no single plant responds perfectly to every season. A community that depends entirely on one harvest risks disaster when rainfall shifts or pests spread. In the most exposed places, farmers create manavai, circular or oval stone enclosures built low to the ground. Within these walls, crops receive shelter from strong winds and benefit from a warmer, more humid microclimate. The stones absorb heat during the day and release it slowly after sunset. Moisture condenses on their surfaces and drips toward the protected soil. Bananas and other sensitive plants can grow inside conditions that differ noticeably from the open landscape only a few meters away. Thousands of these enclosures remain scattered across the island, many now partly buried or overgrown. They are quiet monuments to survival, smaller than the moai but repeated far more often. The islanders also use natural and artificial depressions called pew to shelter individual plants. Some are formed by removing stones or digging into the ground. Others take advantage of collapsed lava tubes and uneven terrain. These pits reduce wind exposure and collect moisture. In a landscape without irrigation canals, engineering occurs at the scale of roots. Water is not carried across the island in large channels. Instead, the ground around each plant is altered so that scarce moisture stays where it falls. This agricultural system changes how population estimates must be understood. Early European visitors sometimes described an island that appeared barren and incapable of supporting large numbers. Modern estimates of the pre-contact population vary widely, ranging from only a few thousand to figures considerably higher. Scholars still debate the maximum number, partly because agricultural productivity depends on assumptions about rainfall, crop yields, labour, and the extent of rock gardens at different periods. What survives in the record suggests that the landscape could feed more people than its treeless appearance initially implies, especially when managed by farmers who understand its microclimates. Food production is tied closely to social organisation. Large households control clusters of gardens, but cultivation requires cooperation during planting, maintenance, and harvest. Labour invested in stone fields represents stored effort that can pass between generations. A productive plot is therefore more than a seasonal resource. It is inherited infrastructure. Boundaries matter because one family may possess ground improved by decades of work, while another occupies soil that remains thin and exposed. Rights to land are reinforced through ancestry, and the Moai watching inland stand over territories whose value is measured in harvest as much as sacred prestige. Chickens provide another layer of security. They are housed in substantial stone structures known as hair moa, built to protect them from weather, rats, and theft. The birds supply meat and eggs, but their importance goes beyond routine consumption. They can be preserved alive until needed, making them a form of stored wealth. Their bones become tools, and their feathers serve decorative or ceremonial uses. A household with many chickens possesses a resource that can be exchanged, offered at feasts or consumed during shortage. Seafood continues to supplement the diet, though access is uneven. Shore fishing, shellfish gathering, and the collection of marine animals remain important near productive coasts. Stone fish hooks and bone hooks are shaped for different catches. Fishing knowledge includes currents, seasons, lunar cycles, and the behavior of particular species. Yet declining large timber may limit deep water expeditions, pushing more dependence toward coastal waters. Marine food alone cannot support the whole population, especially as seabird colonies diminish and offshore hunting becomes more difficult. Cooking methods conserve fuel as well as food. Earth ovens trap heat beneath stones and soil, allowing meals to cook slowly with limited firewood. Crops can be baked, steamed, dried, or stored. Nothing edible is casually discarded in a place where scarcity can return after one dry cycle. Even waste enters the agricultural system, enriching gardens near houses. The boundary between settlement and field is therefore porous. Daily life produces the materials that help the next crop grow. Evidence from human bones and household remains complicates older images of universal famine. There are signs of nutritional stress in some individuals and periods, but not a simple island-wide descent into permanent starvation before European contact. The people adapt too effectively for that. Cannibalism appears in later stories and has often been used to portray complete collapse, yet archaeological proof is limited and interpretations remain disputed. Such practices may have occurred during conflict or ritual, as they did in some other societies, but they cannot carry the explanatory burden once placed upon them. The greater truth is less dramatic and more impressive. Rapa Nui farmers survive ecological transformation by redesigning the island at ground level. They cannot restore the vanished palms quickly, but they can slow evaporation around a sweet potato. They cannot summon rivers, but they can trap moisture among stones. They cannot escape poor soil, but they can alter its temperature, mineral content, and resistance to erosion. From the platforms, the ancestors gaze across fields that outsiders may mistake for rubble. In reality, those stones feed the living. The monumental society depends on this hidden agricultural landscape, because every carver, rope maker, ritual specialist, and transport crew must eat. The moai rise only because thousands of small gardens succeed. The stone gardens do more than feed families. They divide the island into territories of labour, inheritance, and obligation. Every field improved with volcanic rock represents years of work that cannot simply be moved elsewhere. Every protected spring, fishing place, chicken house, and sheltered planting pit has value because another household may not possess an equivalent resource. As the population grows and the landscape becomes more intensively used, survival depends increasingly on who controls these places, who may enter them, and which ancestors are remembered as the rightful owners. Rapa Nui society appears to have been organised through extended kin groups often described as clans, each associated with particular territories. The exact boundaries and political relationships are difficult to reconstruct because the written accounts come late, after disease, enslavement, missionary influence, and colonial disruption have already transformed the island. Oral traditions preserve names of groups, leaders, and conflicts. But scholars still debate how accurately later descriptions reflect the earlier monument-building centuries. What survives in the landscape suggests a society divided into local communities that remain culturally connected while competing for status, land, labour, and sacred authority. These territories often extend from the coast toward the island's interior, giving communities access to several kinds of resource. A narrow strip may include a ceremonial platform near the sea, fishing grounds offshore, houses and gardens farther inland, and perhaps quarrying or grazing areas on higher slopes. This arrangement reduces dependence on a single ecological zone. A household living near the coast still requires inland fields. Farmers farther upslope still need salt, shellfish, fish, and access to fresh water. Territory therefore works less like a simple block of property and more like a corridor connecting different parts of the island's economy. Leadership grows from this network of kinship and control. Chiefs and high-ranking families claim descent from important ancestors, but rank alone cannot maintain authority. Leaders must persuade, reward, organize, and redistribute. Monument building provides one arena in which this authority becomes visible. A chief who commissions a moai must secure stone workers, rope makers, transport crews, gardeners, cooks, and ritual specialists. Those workers must be fed, and their households must continue functioning while they labour away from ordinary tasks. The statue therefore represents more than the prestige of one individual. It reveals a community's ability to convert agricultural surplus and social loyalty into coordinated action. Feasting is central to that process. Food binds workers to leaders, settles obligations, marks ceremonies, and transforms harvests into political relationships. Chickens, sweet potatoes, fish, bananas, and other valued foods may be gathered for communal events held near ceremonial platforms. A generous leader demonstrates access to resources and concern for followers. Yet generosity also creates debt. Those who receive food may owe labour, loyalty, or future support. In this way, meals become part of governance. Power is exercised not through a permanent army or written law code, but through ancestry, ritual, reputation, exchange, and the ability to keep people cooperating. The system does not require perfect equality. Archaeological differences among houses, burials, ornaments, and ceremonial structures suggest distinctions of status. Certain families occupy more prestigious positions near platforms. Some individuals possess specialized objects or receive more elaborate treatment after death. Experts who control ritual or technical knowledge may hold influence beyond ordinary households. Stone carvers, for example, depend on patrons. But patrons also depend on carvers. A leader cannot simply command an impressive monument into existence without the cooperation of people who understand the quarry. Specialists may move between territories or work for different communities, carrying knowledge across political boundaries. Basalt tools found at Rano Raraku come from multiple geological sources, suggesting exchange networks that connect the statue quarry with other parts of the island. Stone from one area appears in tools used elsewhere. Obsidian moves between households. Red scoria from Puna Pau travels to platforms far from its source. These materials reveal that clan territories are not sealed worlds. Even rivals depend on exchange, shared expertise, marriage, and access to resources controlled by others. Marriage is especially important on a small island. Families cannot remain isolated indefinitely without creating dangerous levels of inbreeding or political hostility. Partnerships link territories and turn potential enemies into relatives. Children inherit identities that may connect several groups. Disputes over land or rank can therefore become complicated, because the people facing one another across a boundary may also share grandparents, ritual obligations, or marriage ties. Competition is woven through intimacy rather than existing outside it. The Moai intensify this rivalry by making ancestry visible on a monumental scale. When one community raises a larger figure, rebuilds an ahu, or adds a red topknot, neighbouring groups witness the achievement. They may respond with projects of their own. This pattern resembles an arms race, though one fought through prestige rather than continuous violence. Each monument announces that the group possesses fertile land, skilled labour, sacred legitimacy, and leaders capable of mobilizing them. The figures face inland, but their scale speaks across the island. A lesser-known feature of this political landscape is the possibility that pathways and statue roads serve ceremonial purposes even after transport ends. Fallen or abandoned Moai line some routes, and researchers disagree over whether they were lost during movement, deliberately positioned, or left as projects ceased. The roads may have connected communities to the sacred quarry in ways that were social as well as practical. Travelling toward Rano Raraku could mean entering a place where ancestral bodies emerge from the earth. Control over that journey may itself have carried prestige. Competition does not automatically imply collapse. For generations, rivalry may stimulate production, strengthen group identity, and encourage cooperation within communities. Building a monument requires trust and discipline. Agricultural intensification may support larger gatherings. Shared beliefs provide rules for managing disputes. Even conflict can remain limited when opponents depend on one another for marriage, tools, and ritual knowledge. The island is too small for any group to destroy its neighbours without damaging the network that sustains everyone. Yet the same system contains risks. Leaders who demand too much labour may weaken food production. A poor harvest can make promised feasts impossible. A statue that breaks during transport can damage prestige. Groups with less fertile territory may resent those controlling better gardens or fresh water. As timber declines and agriculture becomes more labour-intensive, the surplus available for monument building narrows. Authority based on ancestral protection becomes vulnerable if crops fail despite ceremonies and offerings. The evidence for warfare during the height of Moai construction remains uncertain. Obsidian mata have often been described as spearheads, but many show forms and wear consistent with tools rather than specialized weapons. Skeletal injuries reveal interpersonal violence in some cases, though not necessarily organized. Island-wide war. Defensive structures are rare. No single explanation fully accounts for the political tensions preserved in oral traditions and archaeology. Conflict exists, but older portrayals of constant slaughter probably exaggerate it. Most of the time, power works through quieter means. A boundary stone is respected because generations remember it. A chief receives labour because followers expect food and protection. A specialist guards knowledge because skill carries value. An ancestor stands above a platform because descendants continue to believe that the dead matter to the living. The society holds together through thousands of such agreements, rarely written and never guaranteed. Across Rapa Nui, communities remain separate enough to compete and connected enough to survive. Their monuments grow, their fields become more engineered, and their political identities harden around territory and ancestry. For a time, this balance produces extraordinary results, but it depends on harvests, trust, and the continuing authority of leaders who claim that the ancestors favour their people. when those foundations begin to shift. The same rivalries that once inspired creation will place the old order under increasing strain. The old order does not end with a single rebellion, drought, or fallen statue. It weakens gradually, through pressures that are difficult to separate because they reinforce one another. A poor harvest reduces the food available for workers. Fewer workers slow monument projects. An unfinished monument damages the prestige of the leader who ordered it. Rival groups interpret that failure as weakness. Sacred promises become harder to defend when the ancestors appear unable to protect crops, restore rain, or prevent conflict. The system that once turned cooperation into stone begins to demand more than some communities can safely give. By the later centuries of the monument building period, much of Rapa Nui has already been transformed. The palm forest is largely gone. Large timber is scarce. Seabird colonies have declined or retreated to inaccessible cliffs and offshore islets. Deep water fishing may be more difficult, while the population depends increasingly on gardens that require constant maintenance. Rock mulch, manavai, and sheltered pits make survival possible, but they also make survival labour-intensive. Each productive field is an engineered space that can deteriorate if neglected. A household asked to provide workers for a distant quarry or transport project must balance sacred duty against the immediate needs of planting and repair. This tension may help explain why the scale of moai production becomes so extreme. Systems under pressure do not always shrink immediately. Sometimes they expand. Leaders whose authority depends on ancestral power may commission larger statues precisely because confidence is fading. A more imposing moai can signal that a lineage remains favoured, even when resources are tightening. Rival communities may respond in kind. What looks from the outside like a rational excess may be a political effort to preserve legitimacy through the language everyone still understands. Rano Raraku captures this uncertainty in stone. Hundreds of figures remain at the quarry, including many unfinished or never transported. Some are abandoned because cracks appear during carving. Others may have been waiting for movement when work suddenly ceased. Tools lie among the debris. Statues stand buried to their torsos on the slopes, not because a mysterious catastrophe covered them overnight, but because soil accumulated around figures left in place for centuries. The quarry feels interrupted, yet archaeology cannot identify one precise moment when every carver stopped. Different teams may have ended work at different times as patrons lost influence, labour shifted elsewhere, or the meaning of the monument building changed. Climate adds another layer. Rainfall on Rapa Nui has never been perfectly reliable, and prolonged dry periods could severely affect crops, crater lakes, and coastal water sources. Evidence for specific droughts is still being refined, and scholars debate how closely climate fluctuations align with political change. Even a modest reduction in rainfall, however, would matter on an island already operating near environmental limits. Sweet potatoes are resilient, but they are not invulnerable. Bananas and taro suffer more quickly. A sequence of poor seasons can expose inequalities between territories, especially when some groups control deeper soils or more dependable water. Political authority becomes fragile when leaders cannot redistribute food. Feasts that once demonstrated abundance become difficult to stage. Obligations remain, but rewards shrink. Workers may refuse demands or transfer loyalty to more successful patrons. Families controlling productive gardens gain leverage over ritual elites. The ability to feed people begins to matter more than the ability to claim descent from a famous ancestor. Sacred rank does not disappear, but its practical foundations are tested. At the same time, competition over land may intensify. On a large continent, a dissatisfied group might migrate into a new valley. On Rapa Nui, there is no empty frontier. Every direction reaches the sea. Boundaries become harder because expansion means entering someone else's territory. Theft of crops or chickens carries greater consequences. Stone chicken houses become not only shelters, but protected stores of wealth. Gardens improved by generations of labour cannot be abandoned without enormous loss. Violence, when it occurs, is therefore likely to emerge from close proximity, where rivals know one another and may even share kin. The archaeological evidence for widespread warfare remains ambiguous. Some skeletons show injuries consistent with blows from stone objects. Oral traditions remember battles, feuds, and groups taking refuge in caves. Obsidian mortar can inflict wounds, though many were ordinary cutting tools rather than weapons designed solely for combat. There are few large fortifications, and signs of settlement continue across much of the island. What survives in the record suggests episodes of violence and instability, but not necessarily an uninterrupted war of everyone against everyone. Caves become increasingly important during this period, both as shelters and as protected places for storage or ritual. Rapa Nui's volcanic landscape contains many lava tubes, some with narrow entrances that are easy to conceal. Families may hide food, valuables, or themselves during danger. Certain caves contain paintings, carvings, burials, and evidence of repeated occupation. Their use does not prove permanent social collapse. People throughout the world use caves for practical and sacred reasons, yet the growth of hidden or defensible spaces fits a society in which trust between groups may be weakening. The ancestors themselves may also be changing. Moai once represent a stable relationship between the living and the dead, but sacred systems survive only while communities continue to perform them. If leaders associated with particular statues lose power, those monuments can become targets. Damaging an opponent's moai is not merely vandalism. It attacks the legitimacy of the lineage that raised it. Removing coral eyes deprives the figure of its active gaze. Toppling the body breaks the visible link between ancestor, platform, and territory. The shift away from moai construction does not mean belief vanishes. Religious systems rarely disappear cleanly. Older sacred places remain important even as new rituals emerge. Some statues receive carving associated with later traditions. Platforms continue to be used for burial. Memories of ancestral power survive after figures fall. What changes is the political structure built around the commissioning and raising of monumental ancestors. A different source of authority begins to gather strength near the cliffs of Rano Kau and the ceremonial village of Orongo. Here, attention turns toward the sea, migratory birds, dangerous competition, and a ritual cycle that can redistribute leadership more frequently than hereditary monument building does. The emerging order does not require communities to quarry and transport ever larger statues. It demands courage, athletic skill, ritual knowledge, and control of a contest whose outcome can be renewed each year. This transformation may be less a sudden revolution than an adaptation to altered circumstances. A society with reduced timber, strained resources, and contested leadership needs institutions that cost less to maintain and can settle rivalry without endless monument building. The old system falters because its economic and political foundations become difficult to sustain, not because the islanders lose intelligence or abandon organization. They respond by reshaping authority. Across the island, unfinished faces remain attached to the mountain. Roads still lead toward platforms where fewer new statues arrive. Gardens continue to produce food beneath the gaze of the older ancestors, but confidence in their protection is no longer secure. The stone figures have not yet all fallen. Still, the world that raised them is drawing toward its end, and the first signs of a new sacred order are already circling above the offshore rocks. The first statues do not fall because the islanders suddenly forget what they mean. They fall because meaning itself has become contested. A moai standing on an ahu is not only stone, it is the visible authority of a lineage, the claim of a community to land, ancestry, and sacred protection. To bring one down is therefore to attack far more than a monument. It is to announce that the power behind it has failed, that the descendants beneath its gaze can no longer defend the order their ancestors created. Across Rapa Nui, many moai are eventually toppled face down, their bodies pulled from the platforms and their necks or heads broken against carefully placed stones. The pattern suggests deliberate action. Some figures fall backward, but many are brought forward in a way that damages the face, the most symbolically charged part of the statue. Coral eyes disappear. Red scoria top knots roll away from their original positions. Platforms that once presented complete ancestral figures become fields of fractured bodies. The timing of this destruction remains one of the most difficult questions in the island's history. Earlier interpretations placed widespread toppling before European contact and treated it as the final act of an ecological collapse. More recent research suggests a longer, uneven process, with some monuments still standing when Dutch sailors arrived in 1722 and others possibly remaining upright for decades afterward. European visitors in the 18th century describe both standing and fallen statues, implying that the transformation is still underway. The evidence remains incomplete because outsiders record only brief encounters, often misunderstanding what they see. This matters because the fallen moai cannot be explained by one island-wide event. Some may have been toppled during disputes between rival groups. Others may have fallen after their associated communities lost influence or moved. Earthquakes, erosion, unstable platforms, and deliberate later damage may account for a smaller number. Certain statues may have been lowered as part of ritual change rather than destroyed in anger. No single explanation fully accounts for every fallen figure. Oral traditions collected in later centuries describe periods of conflict between groups sometimes identified as the long ears and the short ears. In popular retellings, these names become separate races locked in a final war, but such interpretations are unsupported. The terms may refer to social divisions, status groups, rival lineages, or later attempts to organize memories of complex conflicts. Some stories describe a defensive ditch filled with fire and a massacre near Poik. Archaeologists have investigated the feature, but evidence for the dramatic battle once imagined there is uncertain. Charcoal exists, yet it does not establish the full story preserved in later accounts. What the traditions do preserve is a memory of division. Communities that once competed through building may begin competing through destruction. If one lineage claims that its ancestor commands greater mana, toppling that ancestor's moai is a direct challenge. The act transforms sacred prestige into humiliation. It also requires organization. Even after centuries of exposure, many statues weigh several tons. Pulling one down demands ropes, leverage, planning, and a group willing to take responsibility for the consequences. The destruction may unfold as a cycle. One community attacks a rival platform. The rival responds. Each fallen statue justifies another. As more figures lose their eyes and positions, the old system becomes harder to restore. Carvers no longer produce replacements on the previous scale. Transport networks are less active. Leaders cannot easily summon the labor required to rebuild. A symbolic attack becomes permanent because the institutions that once repaired sacred damage have weakened. Yet the image of total chaos is misleading. The islanders continue cultivating fields, raising children, keeping chickens, fishing, performing ceremonies, and maintaining social identities. A society can experience conflict without ceasing to function. Indeed, conflict often becomes highly structured. Groups know which territories belong to which lineages. Revenge may follow accepted expectations. Refuge places, alliances, and negotiated settlements limit some violence even when they cannot end it. Human remains reveal injuries, including skull fractures and wounds consistent with interpersonal fighting, but the numbers do not indicate universal slaughter. Obsidian blades may have been used as weapons, though their common role in daily work remains clear. There is little evidence for the vast armies or endless battles imagined in older accounts. The political landscape is more likely one of raids, feuds, localized confrontations, and symbolic attacks concentrated around resources and sacred authority. Food insecurity may intensify these tensions without producing complete famine. A drought affects some territories more severely than others. Theft of sweet potatoes or chickens becomes more serious when stores are low. Families retreat into hidden caves during dangerous periods, carrying food and valuable objects with them. Some caves contain narrow entrances and internal chambers suited to concealment. Their use suggests fear, but also planning. People are not simply overwhelmed. They adapt to instability as they adapted earlier to wind, drought, and deforestation. Cannibalism enters later stories of this period and becomes one of the most sensational elements in outside descriptions. Insults remembered in oral tradition refer to the flesh of enemies, and some human bones may show modifications consistent with violent treatment. Yet the evidence is too limited to support claims that cannibalism became routine or resulted from island-wide starvation. It may have occurred in warfare, ritual humiliation, or isolated acts. Scholars still debate the extent, and the subject has often been exaggerated to portray the islanders as authors of their own destruction. The fall of the Moai is better understood as a political and religious shift than as proof that society has ended. Ancestral authority remains important, but it no longer monopolizes sacred life. Some fallen statues receive new carvings connected to later beliefs. Platforms continue to hold burials. People live near monuments even after they are toppled. The past is not erased, it is reinterpreted. This is common when institutions lose legitimacy. The sacred objects of an older order may be attacked because they still possess power. No one bothers to topple a statue that means nothing. The violence directed at the Moai reveals their continuing importance. Breaking the face of an ancestor is an attempt to break the social world organized beneath that face. By the time most of the great figures lie down, Rapa Nui has entered a new political landscape. Leadership is less securely tied to the families that commissioned monuments. Authority must be won and renewed through different rituals. Attention turns increasingly toward the cliffs of Orongo, where the sea crashes beneath a ceremonial village and small offshore islets become the focus of an annual contest. The ancestors remain scattered across the island, their bodies lying among grass, stone, and abandoned platforms. They have not vanished from memory, but they no longer stand above every community as unquestioned guardians. Their fall clears space for a new sacred figure, not carved from stone and raised for centuries, but chosen through danger, competition, and the arrival of a single egg from across the sea. At the southwestern edge of Rapa Nui, the land ends in a wall of black volcanic rock. The cliffs of Ranokau fall sharply toward the Pacific, and the wind rises almost without warning from the water below. On the crater's rim stands Orongo, a ceremonial village built from low stone structures whose walls seem pressed into the earth for protection. From here, the islanders look toward three small islets offshore, dark shapes surrounded by violent currents and breaking waves. This becomes the center of a new political and religious order, one that replaces the permanence of stone ancestors with a contest renewed every year. The sacred focus is the sooty tern, a seabird that returns seasonally to nest on the islets. Its arrival marks a moment when the sea, sky, and human world converge. the first egg of the season becomes the object of intense competition, not because it provides nourishment, but because it carries authority. The man whose representative secures it allows his patron to become the Tangata Manu, the birdman, a leader invested with sacred power for the coming year. The change is profound. Under the older system, authority is tied strongly to ancestry, inherited rank, and the ability to commission monuments that may stand for generations. The birdman system is more fluid. Prestige must be won again and again. Rival leaders select champions, often described as hopu, who undertake the dangerous journey on their behalf. The chief does not necessarily swim himself. Instead, he depends on a representative whose strength, endurance, loyalty, and luck determine the political future of an entire group. The contestants gather at Orongo, where rituals and preparations unfold among houses built from overlapping slabs of volcanic stone. The structures have narrow entrances and curved interiors, designed to withstand the relentless wind. Some are associated with priests, competitors, and high-ranking observers who may remain there through the season. The village is not a permanent settlement in the ordinary sense. It is a ceremonial arena, occupied during one of the most important periods of the year. Below the cliffs lies the first danger. The champions must descend from Orongo toward the sea, carrying bundles of reeds that may serve as floats. The route crosses unstable rock, and one mistake can send a man into the water before he reaches a safe launching point. From there, he must swim through cold currents toward the islet of Motunui, the largest of the three. Sharks may be present. Waves strike the volcanic shore with enough force to break bones. The distance is not vast, but the conditions make it deadly. Once on Motunui, the competitors wait for the birds. This waiting may last days or weeks. They shelter in caves or rough stone structures, surviving on limited food carried with them or gathered nearby. The islet offers little comfort. It is exposed to wind, salt, and sun, with almost no fresh water. The men watch nesting birds, listen for calls, and compete to identify the first egg. The exact rules remain partly uncertain because the fullest accounts are recorded only after the tradition has already weakened. Scholars still debate how formalized the contest was in earlier centuries and how much later observers misunderstood. When a champion finds an egg, he must return with it intact. The fragility of the object is part of its power. He may bind it to his forehead, protect it within a woven holder, or carry it with extreme care while swimming back across the channel and climbing the cliffs. A cracked egg could erase the achievement. The journey therefore requires restraint as well as strength. Victory belongs not merely to the fastest swimmer but to the man who can preserve a delicate symbol while crossing one of the island's most dangerous landscapes. The successful champion announces the result to those waiting above. His patron becomes the birdman, while the champion himself gains status and rewards. The new leader may shave his head, allow his fingernails to grow, and enter a period of sacred seclusion. Accounts suggest that the Tangata Manu lives under strict ritual restrictions, sometimes residing for months in a specially designated house. He is honoured, but also separated. Sacred power brings privilege and constraint at the same time. The birdman's authority may include control over the distribution of resources, protection for his group, and political influence during the year of his title. The victory does not create a centralized monarchy in the modern sense. Rival clans continue to exist, and older hereditary ranks remain important. Yet the contest provides a mechanism for rotating prestige among competing groups. It channels political rivalry into a ritual whose outcome is visible, dramatic, and theoretically accepted by all participants. This does not mean the contest is peaceful. Rival champions may interfere with one another. Accounts describe intimidation, sabotage, violence, and revenge connected to the competition. A group that repeatedly wins can use sacred prestige to dominate others. The ritual regulates rivalry without eliminating it. Still, it may reduce the need for every ambitious leader to commission larger and larger monuments. The contest demands courage and organization, but it does not require decades of quarrying and transport. Orongo's rock art reveals the transformation. The surfaces around the ceremonial village carry hundreds of petroglyphs, many depicting figures with human bodies and bird-like heads. These images are compact, curved, and dynamic, very different from the immense stillness of the Moai. Other carvings show birds, faces, genital forms, and symbols connected to fertility and ritual power. Some images overlap, suggesting repeated visits and generations of use. The stone remains a medium of memory, but the sacred body carved into it has changed. The deity Makemake becomes central to this new order, associated with creation, fertility, and the Birdman tradition. Makemake appears to occupy a place that differs from the ancestral figures of the Moai period. The precise development of this belief is difficult to trace. It may draw on older Polynesian traditions reshaped by the island's isolation, or it may represent a more distinctly Rapa Nui religious transformation. What survives in the record suggests continuity beneath the change. Sacred authority still connects people to fertility, food, ancestry, and the forces controlling life, but the symbols and institutions expressing that connection evolve. The offshore islets also gain importance because seabirds have become rarer on the main island. Rats, hunting, and habitat change push many nesting colonies toward places difficult for people and predators to reach. The Birdman ceremony therefore grows around a surviving concentration of life. The annual return of the terns becomes both ecological event and political opportunity. A bird's egg carries the promise of renewal in a landscape where many older sources of abundance have diminished. The system demonstrates that Rapa Nui society is not frozen after the fall of the Moai. It remains inventive. Leaders develop new forms of legitimacy. Ritual specialists adapt older beliefs. Communities continue to compete within shared rules. Art changes. Sacred geography shifts from the ancestral platforms facing farmland to the cliffs overlooking dangerous water. Yet this new order arises just as a greater danger approaches from beyond the horizon. The Birdman contest can manage rivalry among islanders, but it cannot defend them against ships bringing firearms, disease, enslavement, and foreign religions. Orongo still commands the cliffs when outsiders begin visiting more frequently. The terns continue returning, champions continue swimming, and new birdmen continue entering seclusion. But the world around the island is no longer closed, and the next transformation will not be chosen by the people of Rapa Nui. Among all the objects carried away from Rapa Nui, none is more puzzling than a small collection of wooden tablets covered with rows of tiny signs. Human figures bend into strange poses. Birds, fish, plants, tools, geometric forms, and creatures that seem to combine several bodies appear one after another. The signs are carved with remarkable precision, often filling nearly every usable part of the wood. They belong to a system now called Rongorongo, and they preserve one of the island's deepest unanswered questions: did Rapa Nui create the only indigenous writing tradition known from Polynesia? Or are these marks something different from writing in the strict sense? The surviving tablets offer no easy answer. Only around 24 objects generally accepted as authentic remain, scattered among museums and collections far from the island. Some are complete tablets, others are fragments, staffs, ornaments, or pieces reused for purposes that may have had nothing to do with their original carvings. Their names are modern labels given by researchers. usually letters or descriptive titles. No surviving object can be placed securely within an undisturbed archaeological layer, and none carries a date that can be read directly from the text. This uncertainty begins with the material itself. Wood is rare on the treeless island encountered by later visitors, and several tablets appear to have been carved from driftwood or from imported material. One famous object was made from part of a European ore, showing that at least some inscriptions were produced after foreign contact. That does not prove the whole system is recent. Islanders may have copied an older tradition onto whatever wood became available. But it prevents a simple claim that every surviving tablet belongs to the centuries when the moai were still being raised. The word rongorongo is often translated as something like recitation, chanting, or speaking forth. Later accounts describe specialists who memorized texts and performed them while following the signs. Boys of elite families were reportedly trained in special schools, where they learned the tablets under the guidance of the knowledgeable teachers. By the time outsiders attempted to document this tradition, however, the social world that sustained it had already suffered catastrophic damage. Many of the people most likely to understand the signs had died, been enslaved, or lost their authority under missionary rule. The inscriptions follow an unusual pattern called reverse boustrophodon. A reader begins along one line, then rotates the tablet at the end and continues along the next line in the opposite direction. As a result, every alternate row appears upside down when the tablet remains fixed. The system resembles the back and forth path of an ox ploughing a field, though no ox ever walked the gardens of Rapa Nui. This arrangement is deliberate and consistent enough to show that the signs were not random decoration. There are several hundred distinct glyph forms, depending on whether small variations are counted as separate signs. Some appear frequently, while others occur only once. Groups of signs repeat across different tablets, suggesting formulas, names, titles, genealogical patterns, songs, prayers, or ritual sequences. One tablet appears to contain a structured series connected to the lunar cycle, with signs that may correspond to nights or phases of the moon. This is among the strongest indications the Rongorongo records organized information rather than merely decorative imagery. Yet organized information is not necessarily full writing. A true writing system normally represents spoken language in a way that allows a reader to recover words, grammar, and sentences without already knowing the content. Mnemonic notation works differently. It may guide a trained performer through a chant or genealogy, while leaving much of the wording stored in memory. Musical notation, tally systems, heraldic symbols, and ritual marks can preserve complex information without encoding ordinary speech. Rongorongo may fall somewhere along this spectrum. Decipherment is difficult because there is no reliable bilingual text, no Rapa Nui equivalent of the Rosetta Stone pairing the signs with a known language. The corpus is small, and many tablets may repeat ritual material rather than ordinary conversation. Later islanders asked to read the objects sometimes gave inconsistent explanations, perhaps because they no longer understood the old system, because the tablets shown to them were unfamiliar, or because outsiders failed to grasp how performance and inscription work together. The evidence remains incomplete, and confident translations produced over the years have not gained broad scholarly acceptance. Some researchers have argued that Rongorongo predates European arrival and represents an independent invention of writing. Such a development would be extraordinary but not impossible. Rapa Nui society possesses specialized knowledge, complex genealogies, ritual offices, calendrical observation, and a strong tradition of symbolic carving. The absence of metal tools poses no obstacle. Obsidian flakes can incise wood with great precision, and fine lines on surviving tablets show that their creators mastered this technique. Others proposed that the idea emerged only after islanders saw Europeans using written documents. Dutch visitors arrived in 1722, Spanish ships followed in 1770, and later expeditions brought books, signatures, maps, and official papers. During the Spanish visit, several Rapa Nui leaders placed marks on a document of annexation. These marks do not clearly match mature Rongorongo signs, but they prove that islanders encountered alphabetic writing before the tablets were collected. Seeing foreigners use visible signs to preserve speech or authority may have inspired local experts to formalize an existing mnemonic tradition into something more script-like. A third possibility lies between these positions. Rapa Nui may already have possessed systems of carved symbols used in ritual, genealogy, ownership, and recitation. Contact with European writing could then have changed how those signs were arranged or understood. Rather than appearing suddenly as either a completely independent script or a direct imitation, Rongorongo may have developed through several stages. No single explanation fully accounts for the combination of local iconography. Uncertain dating and apparent structural regularity. The glyphs themselves belong unmistakably to the island's world. Birds and bird-like humans recall the ritual landscape of Vorongo. Fish and marine creatures evoke the surrounding ocean. Human forms sit, stand, gesture, or hold objects. Some signs resemble plants, paddles, ornaments, or body parts. Their meanings cannot be guessed safely from appearance alone. A bird might represent the word for bird, the name of a person, a deity, a sound, a clan, or an abstract concept. Writing systems frequently use familiar images in ways that no longer match their literal shape. The greatest destruction of Rongorongo knowledge comes not from mystery, but from history. During the 19th century, slave raids and epidemics reduced the Rapa Nui population to a tiny fraction of its earlier size. Priests, teachers, chiefs, and trained reciters disappear. Missionaries discourage or destroy objects associated with the old religion. Some tablets are burned, hidden, traded, or carried abroad as curiosities. By the time serious attempts are made to preserve the tradition, its chain of teaching has been broken. Rongorongo therefore stands at the boundary between memory and silence. The tablets prove that Rapa Nui intellectual life was richer than outsiders first assumed, but they refuse to reveal exactly how that knowledge worked. They may preserve chants once heard before the Moai, genealogies of chiefs, calendars tied to birds and moonlight, or prayers recited at Orongo. They may record language, cue memory, or combine both. Their unread signs also carry a darker lesson. A script does not survive merely because objects remain. It survives because people continue teaching how marks become meaning. Once those people are removed, the wood can endure while the voice disappears. And on Rapa Nui, the forces that break that voice are already approaching in wooden ships from a world whose writing will document the island's suffering far more clearly than the islanders are allowed to document their own. The first European ship appears off Rapa Nui on Easter Sunday in 1722, and with it the island enters a new kind of isolation. Until that moment, distance has protected the community as much as it has confined it. The ocean limits timber, trade, and escape. But it also keeps most foreign armies, diseases, and empires beyond the horizon. When Dutch commander Jacob Roggeveen approaches with 3 ships, that protection begins to fail. The islanders see vessels larger than any canoe, carrying men clothed in unfamiliar materials and armed with technologies that compress violence into a flash of powder and smoke. The encounter is brief, tense, and badly understood on both sides. Islanders paddle out to the ships, eager to inspect iron, cloth, beads, and other objects unlike anything available locally. Iron immediately possesses practical value. A nail can become a cutting edge stronger and more durable than stone. A piece of metal can be reshaped into a hook, chisel, or ornament to the Europeans. However, the islanders' interest appears as theft or disorder. The Dutch attempt to control the crowd through signals, threats, and weapons whose meaning the Rapa Nui cannot yet fully grasp. At some point during the landing, Dutch soldiers opened fire. Roggeveen's account suggests the shooting may have begun through confusion or panic rather than a planned massacre. But that distinction offers little comfort to those struck. Islanders are killed and wounded within sight of the Moai. The event establishes a pattern repeated across the Pacific. Europeans interpret unfamiliar behavior as aggression, respond with overwhelming force, and then describe the survivors as fearful or treacherous. Roggeveen's men report an inhabited island with cultivated fields, chickens, houses, and large standing statues. Their observations undermine the later myth that Rapa Nui society had already vanished into total ruin. Some Moai remain upright. People gather in significant numbers. The landscape supports a functioning population. The visitors also notice the limited trees and small canoes, though their short stay gives them little understanding of rock gardening, freshwater collection, clan territories, or the political transformations already reshaping the island. The Dutch leave after only a few days. They do not establish a settlement or return immediately, but their arrival changes what is possible. The island is now known to European navigation. Its approximate position enters maps and sailing records. Future captains may find it deliberately rather than by chance. At first, those visits remain infrequent enough that Rapa Nui continues much of its own political and ritual life. Yet every ship carries the potential for new trade, violence, disease, or abduction. Spanish vessels arrive in 1770 and claim the island for the Spanish crown, giving it another foreign name and conducting ceremonies whose political meaning is probably incomprehensible to most islanders. Local leaders make marks on an annexation document, an episode later drawn into debates over Rongorongo and whether islanders already possessed a system of writing. The Spanish do not build a permanent colony, and their claim remains mostly symbolic. Still, the performance reveals a widening gap between two ideas of ownership. Rapa Nui land is organized through ancestry, territory, and inherited relationships. European empires claim islands through flags, signatures, and declarations made on behalf of distant monarchs. 4 years later, James Cook reaches Rapa Nui. His expedition finds a population that appears reduced and a landscape marked by fallen statues and social strain. Cook is ill during much of the visit, and his crew remains only briefly. Their descriptions are valuable but limited. They record what they can see from a few landing places and interpret it through expectations formed elsewhere. Differences between the Dutch and British accounts have often been used to argue for rapid collapse between 1722 and 1774, but such a conclusion may be too simple. The visitors land in different areas, count people imperfectly, and observe a society already changing from local causes as well as foreign contact. European ships bring material opportunities. Islanders acquire iron tools, cloth, beads, and other goods through exchange. Metal can reduce the labor needed to carve wood or cut fiber. Foreign objects become symbols of rank or novelty. Yet trade also creates dependence and rivalry. A group controlling access to a landing site may gain advantages over inland communities. Chiefs compete to secure valuable goods. Sailors sometimes exchange objects for food, water, labor, or sexual access, introducing new tensions into existing social relationships. Disease is the most dangerous cargo, though its early impact is difficult to measure. European crews carry pathogens to which isolated populations may have little immunity. Not every visit produces a documented epidemic, and the evidence for specific outbreaks during the 18th century remains uncertain. The absence of detailed records does not mean the danger is absent. illness can spread after a ship departs, leaving no European witness behind. Small communities are especially vulnerable because the death of a few elders may erase specialized knowledge as well as reduce population. Foreign violence also takes forms beyond open gunfire. Sailors seize objects from ceremonial places. They enter houses without understanding restrictions. They pursue people who resist exchange. Some abduct islanders for information, labor, or curiosity, even when only temporarily. Firearms change the balance of any confrontation. A stone blade or thrown rock cannot match a musket at close range, and islanders learn quickly that the visitor's weapons can kill from a distance. The Europeans, meanwhile, develop their own story about Rapa Nui. The statues fascinate them, but the people who made them are often treated as a degraded remnant incapable of such work. This assumption allows outsiders to separate the monuments from their creators. The Moai become a puzzle supposedly requiring a lost race, vanished civilization, or foreign influence. The living islanders are reduced to evidence of decline rather than recognized as descendants of the builders and carriers of the same cultural tradition. The mistake is convenient. If the present population is imagined as disconnected from the monuments, foreigners can claim authority over the past. They can remove artifacts, rename places, and dismiss oral knowledge as unreliable. The island becomes an object of European discovery even though people have lived there for centuries. Its history begins in foreign accounts, with the moment a European sees it. Contact also destabilizes the Birdman Order. Foreign ships arrive according to no ritual calendar. They introduce goods and powers that do not depend on winning the egg at Motu Nui. A chief favored by visiting sailors may gain influence outside traditional systems. Missionaries will later attack the religious foundations of Orongo more directly. But even early encounters reveal that authority can now come from access to outsiders. Still, Rapa Nui is not immediately conquered. For much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the islanders continue governing themselves. The Birdman contest persists. Gardens remain active. Oral traditions, carving, fishing, and clan identities survive. Islanders adopt selected foreign materials without surrendering their own world. Contact is disruptive, but not yet fatal. The greatest disaster arrives not through explorers claiming discovery, but through men seeking bodies. By the 19th century, labour demands elsewhere in the Pacific turn isolated islands into hunting grounds for slavers. Rapa Nui's remoteness no longer protects it because ships now cross the ocean regularly and know exactly where to look. The same sea that once carried the founders toward a new homeland begins carrying their descendants away in chains. The ships that arrive in the early 1860s do not come to admire the statues or exchange iron for food. They come for people. Across the Pacific, plantations and mines demand labour, and recruiters operating from Peru begin seizing islanders through coercion, deception, and outright violence. Rapa Nui is especially vulnerable. Its population is small, its coastline difficult to defend, and its people have no firearms capable of matching armed crews. In a series of raids, hundreds are captured and forced aboard ships, including chiefs, priests, ritual specialists, and others whose knowledge holds the community together. The largest raids occur in 1862 and 1863. Exact numbers remain uncertain because records are incomplete and captains conceal illegal activity. But estimates often suggest that roughly 1,000 or more Rapa Nui people are taken. Perhaps a substantial portion of the entire population. Some are lured aboard with promises of trade or work. Others are seized on shore. Resistance is met with gunfire. Families watch relatives disappear beyond the horizon with little expectation that they will ever return. Those carried to Peru face conditions designed for extraction rather than survival. Many are sent to guano deposits, plantations, domestic service, or other forms of forced labour. Disease spreads rapidly among captives already weakened by confinement, hunger, and trauma. Most die within months. International protests eventually pressure Peruvian authorities to stop the raids and repatriate some surviving Pacific Islanders. But even this return becomes another disaster. The handful sent back toward Rapa Nui carry infections, including smallpox or similar epidemic diseases, which spread among a population with little immunity. The demographic collapse is staggering. A society that may have numbered several thousand before intensive foreign contact falls to only a few hundred, and by 1877, the recorded population reaches a low point of just 111 people. Numbers alone do not capture what is lost. When a community loses 9 people out of every 10, it loses specialists, grandparents, navigators, healers, farmers, carvers, storytellers, and keepers of genealogies. Knowledge that has survived for centuries can vanish in a single epidemic because no trained successor remains alive. Rongorongo suffers precisely this fate. If dedicated schools or lineages once taught the signs, the slave raids strike directly at the people most likely to preserve them. Later attempts to find fluent readers produce confused and contradictory results. Some islanders remember chants associated with tablets, but cannot explain individual glyphs. Others may improvise under pressure from outsiders eager for translations. The surviving wood remains covered in signs. Yet the human system that gave those signs meaning has been torn apart. The Birdman tradition also weakens under this assault. Ritual leadership depends on communities large enough to organize champions, maintain sacred places, and recognize the authority of the yearly winner. When clans are decimated and survivors are struggling to bury the dead, protect children, and produce food, the old competition becomes difficult to sustain. The final known Birdman ceremonies occur during the 19th century, though the exact date of their end remains debated. Orongo does not lose significance immediately, but its political world is collapsing around it. Missionaries arrive during this vulnerable period. Christianity offers some islanders protection, medicine, literacy, and new connections to the outside world. But conversion is not culturally neutral. Missionaries condemn ancestral rituals, sacred images, and practices associated with the older religion. Traditional ceremonies are discouraged or forbidden. Objects are destroyed, hidden, surrendered, or carried overseas. Islanders receive new names, new prayers, and a foreign written language, while much of their own ceremonial knowledge is dismissed as superstition. This transformation cannot be reduced to simple victimhood. Rapa Nui people make choices within terrible constraints. Some adopt Christianity sincerely. Some use missionary relationships to gain protection from raiders or abusive traders. Others combine new beliefs with older concepts, preserving ancestral meanings beneath Christian forms. Conversion may divide families, but it can also provide a new structure after the destruction of older institutions. Survival often requires accommodation without complete surrender. Even as disease and missionization reshape the island, commercial interests move to control the land. In the late 19th century, foreign entrepreneurs established sheep ranching operations that eventually occupy most of Rapa Nui. The surviving islanders are confined largely to the settlement of Hangaroa, while vast areas used by their ancestors become grazing land. Stone gardens, ceremonial sites, and family territories are absorbed into an economy designed for export rather than local life. Sheep move through landscapes once organized by clans, damaging archaeological features and reducing access to traditional resources. Chile annexes Rapa Nui in 1888 through an agreement whose meanings differ sharply between the parties. Chilean authorities treat it as a transfer of sovereignty. Rapa Nui leaders appear to understand the arrangement more as a partnership or protection agreement in which their continued rights to the land remain recognized. The written versions and oral explanations do not align neatly. Scholars still debate the legal and political implications, but the practical result is clear. Control increasingly passes to a distant state and private companies. For decades, the island is administered less as a community than as a ranch. Residents face restrictions on movement and cannot travel freely across ancestral land. Company guards control access beyond Hangaroa. Food, wages, and supplies depend on external managers. Abuse and neglect are repeatedly reported. The people who once crossed the island to tend gardens, visit sacred places, and maintain clan territories are treated as labourers confined within their own homeland. This period creates another misleading image of Rapa Nui. Visitors encounter a small, impoverished population living near fallen monuments and assume they are witnessing the natural endpoint of ecological failure. They often ignore the slave raids, epidemics, missionary disruption, land seizure, and forced confinement that produced the conditions before them. Colonial violence is mistaken for evidence that the islanders destroyed themselves. The story of environmental collapse becomes convenient because it moves responsibility backward in time and away from the outsiders standing on the island. Yet cultural memory survives. Elders continue reciting genealogies and place names. Families remember which lands belong to which ancestors, even when fences prevent access. Songs, dances, carvings, fishing practices, and oral traditions persist in altered forms. Knowledge is damaged, sometimes beyond recovery, but it is not erased. The remaining population rebuilds through marriage, adaptation, and collective memory. Every Rapa Nui child born after the demographic low point carries the continuity of a society that outside forces nearly extinguished. The Moai endure through this catastrophe, though many are removed, damaged, or treated as museum objects. Foreign expeditions take statues, carvings, tablets, bones, and sacred artifacts. Researchers measure the island while islanders themselves are denied authority over its interpretation. Their ancestors become internationally famous even as their living descendants struggle for basic rights. By the beginning of the 20th century, Rapa Nui has survived deforestation, political upheaval, foreign gunfire, enslavement, epidemic disease, conversion, annexation, and confinement. The greatest collapse in its history is not the fall of the statues. It is the 19th century destruction of its people. And still, against every expectation of disappearance, the community remains. The survival of Rapa Nui is easiest to miss when attention remains fixed on the statues. The Moai dominate photographs, museum displays, travel advertisements, and documentaries because they are immense, silent, and visually unforgettable. Yet the greater continuity lies not in stone but in people. After the population falls to barely more than 100 in the late 19th century, the community does not dissolve. Families rebuild. Children learn a language that colonial systems repeatedly marginalize. Elders preserve place names, genealogies, songs, fishing knowledge, and memories of land from which they have been excluded. The island society survives because culture is carried in ordinary acts long after its most famous monuments have fallen. During the 20th century, Rapa Nui people continue pressing for freedom of movement and greater control over their homeland. The ranching regime that confines residents around Hangaroa gradually weakens, but change comes slowly. Islanders protest restrictions, challenge abusive administrators, and demand recognition as citizens rather than labourers managed by distant authorities. Chile establishes stronger state institutions on the island, bringing schools, medical services, transportation, and bureaucracy. These services create opportunities, but they also deepen outside influence. Spanish becomes dominant in education and government, while traditional knowledge is often treated as a relic rather than a living system. The opening of regular air travel transforms the island again. Rapa Nui is no longer reached only after weeks at sea. Tourists, archaeologists, officials, military personnel, and workers can arrive in hours. Goods become more available, and islanders gain easier access to universities, hospitals, and employment beyond the island. At the same time, the population grows rapidly, waste increases, freshwater demand intensifies, and housing spreads across land dense with archaeological remains. Isolation no longer defines life in the same way, but geography still imposes limits. Almost everything imported must cross thousands of kilometers, and almost everything discarded remains on a small island. Archaeology also begins changing the story told about the past. Early researchers often approach Rapa Nui as a dead civilization whose descendants possess little useful knowledge. Excavations focus on monuments, while living communities are pushed to the edges of interpretation. Over time, this attitude becomes harder to defend. Oral traditions, agricultural remains, settlement patterns, genetic evidence, pollen records, and experimental archaeology reveal a history of adaptation rather than simple self-destruction. The islanders did alter their environment dramatically, but they also created farming systems capable of sustaining life after the forest disappeared. They experienced conflict, but they did not vanish before European arrival. The most severe demographic catastrophe came later through slavery, disease, and colonial exploitation. Restoration projects raise many fallen moai back onto their platforms. At sites such as Ahu Tongariki, rows of statues stand again against the horizon, though their modern restoration creates difficult questions. Raising a moai protects and displays it, but it also changes the historical condition in which it was found. Some figures were deliberately toppled by earlier islanders, and restoring them may impose modern ideas of completeness onto a landscape shaped by political change. Scholars still debate how much intervention is appropriate. For the Rapa Nui community, the issue is not merely technical. These are ancestors, sacred places, tourist attractions, national heritage, and sources of income all at once. Foreign museums continue holding important objects removed during periods when islanders had little power to refuse. The best-known example is the moai called Hoa Hakana Naya, taken from Orongo by a British naval expedition in 1868 and now held in London. Its back carries carvings associated with the Birdman tradition, making it a rare bridge between the world of ancestral statues and the later ritual order. Rapa Nui representatives have requested its return, arguing that the figure is not an isolated artwork but an ancestor separated from its landscape. Debates over repatriation remain unresolved, yet they reveal a broader shift. Islanders increasingly insist on speaking for their own heritage rather than being treated as subjects of someone else's scholarship. Language revival becomes another form of protection. Rapa Nui belongs to the Polynesian language family, carrying echoes of the voyages that first brought settlers across the Pacific. For generations, Spanish language schooling and outside migration weaken its daily use. Many children grow up understanding only fragments. Community educators, families, artists, and cultural organizations work to reverse that decline through bilingual teaching, music, storytelling, ceremonies, and local media. A language preserves more than vocabulary. It carries relationships among places, ancestors, social obligations, winds, plants, and seas that cannot always be translated without loss. Traditional arts also adapt rather than simply return unchanged. Woodcarvers create figures for ceremony, family memory, tourism, and international markets. Dancers perform at local festivals and for visitors. Canoe builders experiment with reconstructing older forms, using both traditional principles and modern materials. Farmers maintain sweet potato plots and stone enclosures while also relying on imported food. Catholic festivals may incorporate elements of older identity. Culture survives through combination, not through isolation from the present. Tourism provides employment and funding for conservation, but it creates pressure on the very sites visitors come to see. Thousands of feet compact soil around platforms and petroglyphs. People climb where they should not, touch fragile surfaces, or remove stones as souvenirs. Vehicles and construction disturb buried remains. Wildfires threaten monuments and grasslands. Coastal erosion undermines platforms built centuries ago near the sea. Rising ocean levels and stronger waves add another danger to sites whose builders never imagined modern climate change. The island's ecology remains equally fragile. Introduced livestock, invasive plants, soil erosion, and limited freshwater continue shaping the landscape. Reforestation efforts face poor soils, strong winds, and the difficulty of deciding which vegetation represents restoration. The vanished palm forest cannot simply be recreated from memory. Planting trees may protect soil and water, but imported species can create new problems. The lesson is not that nature can be returned easily to some untouched original state. Rapa Nui has been a human-shaped environment for centuries, and every attempt to repair it becomes another intervention. This makes the island less a simple warning than a mirror of human resilience. Its history shows that environmental damage can narrow choices without making survival impossible. It shows that societies can reorganize after political systems fail. It also shows that outside violence can cause destruction later blamed on the victims. The popular tale of people foolishly consuming their last tree survives because it is simple. The real story is harder. Generations making decisions under uncertainty, adapting successfully in some ways, failing in others, and then confronting dangers arriving from far beyond their control. Today, the descendants of those first navigators still live beneath the volcanic slopes. They work as teachers, guides, farmers, artists, officials, researchers, fishermen, and activists. They argue over development, conservation, tourism, land, and identity. Because Rapa Nui is not a frozen archaeological park. It is a living society with competing visions of its future. The Moai remain part of that future, but they no longer stand alone at the centre of the story. Their stone faces look inland as they always have, toward homes, roads, gardens, and children. What they watch now is not the remnant of a vanished people. It is the continuation of a community that endured after its forests changed. Its old religion transformed. Its leaders were taken. Its population nearly disappeared. And its land was claimed by outsiders. The greatest achievement of Rapa Nui was never simply carving stone without metal, or preserving memory without writing. It was surviving when nearly every force of history seemed determined to make survival impossible. The wind still crosses Rapa Nui from one coast to the other. It moves over the grass where palms once stood, over stone gardens whose purpose is easy to miss, over fallen figures and restored platforms, over roads that once carried ancestors away from the quarry. At Rano Raraku, unfinished faces remain attached to the mountain, their eyes still closed within the rock. They seem to belong to a future that never arrived, yet even they are part of the island's long memory. Rapa Nui is often described through absence. No metal, no vast forest, no neighbouring land, no surviving key to Rongorongo. No complete explanation for how every statue moved or why every monument fell. But absence is not emptiness. The islanders filled distance with navigation, scarcity with invention, stone with ancestry, and silence with generations of remembered knowledge. They created a society where survival depended on noticing small things: moisture collecting beneath a rock, the return of a bird, the direction of a swell, the strength of a fibre rope, the exact place where fresh water met the sea. Their world changed many times. Forest became grassland. Ancestral statues gave way to the Birdman ritual. Foreign ships turned isolation from protection into vulnerability. Disease, slavery, and colonial rule reduced a living culture almost to a memory. Yet the line was never completely broken. It passed through the survivors, through families who remembered names even when they could no longer enter the lands those names described, through children who inherited fragments and made them whole enough to carry forward. Perhaps that is why the Moai remain so powerful. They do not merely represent a mysterious past. They embody the human desire to stand against forgetting. Their makers knew that bodies vanish, voices fade, and even forests can disappear. So they gave their ancestors faces large enough to outlast generations. Some fell, some broke, some were taken across the sea, but the people they watched over endured. As evening settles across the island, the statues become silhouettes against the fading sky. The ocean beyond them is the same ocean the first voyagers crossed, immense enough to make the island seem impossibly small. Yet on that small piece of volcanic land, a society found ways to live, adapt, remember, and begin again. The deepest lesson of Rapa Nui is not that civilizations inevitably destroy themselves. It is that survival is rarely simple, collapse is rarely complete. And even when history strips away almost everything, memory can remain rooted in the landscape, waiting for someone to listen.